Dr. Joseph Nwoye has been an author, a teacher, a presenter, as well as a lecturer at the highest levels in the United States academia environment for diversity and inclusion. The Systemic Diversity and Inclusion Group has been his brainchild from the beginning. Dr. Nwoye will now join Mr. Myers and probe and question to understand more and better of how police reform could be carried out effectively in the United States and possibly in other places around the world. So, Dr. Nwoye, if you'd like to take yourself off of mute and join us here with Mr. Myers.
Thank you so much, Mr. Adam. I am very appreciative of this particular section. Mr. Carlton Myers, as I listen to you or read about your contributions towards equity and social justice with focus on policing and looking at the community, the police oftentimes provide very low services. In fact, I might even infer that sometimes they contradict the essence of policing. In other words, they do what we don't expect police to do. That makes us to question why are these things happening. So without going too far, I probably have to ask you quite a number of questions. As you well know, at Systemic Diversity Organization, we are all committed to equity and social justice in all aspects, because from our viewpoint, the issue of policing and community that they sort of disenfranchise, mistreat them as if this is not a democratic society is very pervasive in our society. We don't think that that's really the only issue. We think that what we are seeing is so systemic that without addressing that in systemic way, we're not gonna solve the problem. We believe that systemic problems require systemic solutions. But without going deep into the granular part of it, I wanna first thank you for joining us. And my first question to you will be, as you work at the state, federal, and local governments, to be precise, in about 30 states, and of course, you've gotten some wins under your belt, like Illinois. Is there any difference between the states that are on the frontier of accepting your approach versus those who are still behind us?
Yeah, I would say that, and thank you very much, Dr. Nwoye, for having me here. And I would say, yeah, no, there are a number of states that I think, in addition to Illinois, have definitely pushed the standard on progressive policing reform. I would say Washington State, which actually completely banned the use of chokeholds and completely banned the execution and use of no-knock warrants, and completely demilitarized all their law enforcement. In other words, not only prohibiting them from having access to military-style equipment from the federal government or other sources, but also requiring that they do an inventory of all of their military-style equipment that they currently are in possession of, and then come up with a plan in a very short amount of time to either sell that equipment off or to destroy it completely, and therefore completely divesting themselves of the military style equipment and gear. And I also know, as I'm sure a lot of people do, New Mexico passed the most expansive state law related to qualified immunity that does not only cover law enforcement, but it covers all state and local government employees. And so none of them can raise qualified immunity as an affirmative defense in civil court if they're being sued for money, monetary damages, or for other forms of civil of relief in civil court, which is huge when we talk about police accountability. And Colorado, people also know, passed a law that doesn't only do away with qualified immunity, but it also requires that officers have liability insurance. So that way they're able to have insurance to cover them when they are being sued for engaging in misconduct, or that has resulted in violating individuals' constitutional rights. And so there's definitely, in my opinion, a number of states, I would say most states were not that progressive, like I mentioned earlier. States like, for instance, Wisconsin, which did pass policing reform legislation. I worked with their lawmakers on that. When it comes to like the chokehold, they didn't do a chokehold ban like Washington State did. They actually did a chokehold restriction, still allowing officers to use the chokehold under certain circumstances where there's an imminent threat posed to the officer or others of death or great bodily harm. As opposed to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is still in the state of Wisconsin, on the local level, they passed an ordinance which essentially did what Washington State did. It completely prohibits the use of chokeholds under any and all circumstances. And so, we do see that dichotomy there with state and local, where the local is being more progressive, more responsive to the demands of protesters last year for police accountability, rather than the state. And they were even seeing with the state compared to the federal government, where states have actually been able to pass these laws, right? Some of which are very progressive, other ones may not be, but they still were able to pass laws. For the most part, I would say states did it through a bipartisan effort, unlike what happened on the federal level, where there was an attempt. There was a lot of energy and momentum behind it from law enforcement, community members, lawmakers, but they were not able to get it to the finish line. So I do believe that going forward, I would hope that federal lawmakers over these next couple of years, because next year's midterm elections, not only in the federal level, but on the state levels as well. So it's going to be, I think, a very controversial year for most states and definitely for the federal government to try to introduce and pass policing reform legislation. They're going to be too focused on other issues. So over the next couple of years, for them to look at how the state laws and the local laws and ballot initiatives, how are they being implemented, and seeing where are the strengths, right? Where are states and localities doing it the right way? And then where are the weaknesses, or at least where are the areas where they could do better, right? Where there's room for improvement. So I do believe that going forward, I think, in my opinion, that federal lawmakers need to look at what's happening on the state and local governments for implementation to inform them on what is the best way for them to approach policing reform in the next couple of years, and also implementation of policing reform. One other thing I just want to highlight is that I do believe that even with the DOJ, the U.S. Department of Justice, the grant money that they issue to law enforcement and municipalities and state governments, like recently the America Rescue Plan money that was initially meant to go toward addressing COVID-19, but now has been repurposed by the Biden administration to also be used by municipalities and law enforcement agencies to address violent crimes and gun violence because of the uptick in violent crimes and gun violence in America. I think that anytime money is issued on public safety from the federal government, if it's through legislation or through the executive branch, that money needs to be provided not only to law enforcement and municipalities, but just as much money, at least just as much, should also be provided to community-based organizations, direct service providers, and directly impacted individuals to work on public safety in their communities so that they can also have the resources they need to reimagine public safety, if it be with their law enforcement or separate from them, right? And so I think that needs to be the direction that we go in if we really want to nip this long-term issue in the bud with some long-term solutions.
Sorry. Thank you so much for those insightful comments. Glacon, son of Ariston's, an Egyptian, an Athenian philosopher, who had sort of that is, he has an older brother by name Plato, whom we all know about. He asserts that the most important principle for designing an ethical society is to make sure that everyone's reputation is on the line. And when everybody else's reputation is online, people tend to see good and bad behavior. And I think that your number 3, which is CAT, the A, accountability, really focuses on that. That is, it's going to give people opportunity to see what people are doing or what they're not doing. And to that end, I wanted to ask whether you've seen any of those people that you perceive to be very effective or near effective, whether they have produced any data to show that they have changed or they still remain the way they are.
Oh, yes. I mean, we know that if we look to different examples, for instance, we look to Tucson, Arizona, which is a red state, right? That's Trump country, according to what people say. In Tucson, Arizona, for the past 3 going on 4 years now, they, in my opinion, have been implementing community empowerment-centered policing reform to some extent, right? They have not 1, but 4 different civilian oversight authorities, all right? Each one of them focuses on a different aspect of police operations. So they have one that focuses on the hiring and promotions of law enforcement. So that way community members are a part of developing the criteria for what is needed for a person or prerequisites for them to become a law enforcement officer, and what the criteria and prerequisites are for them to be promoted into like a supervisory role, and also to get a raise, etc. They also have 3 different civilian oversight authorities that focus on discipline. And so to me, I mean, when you have that much, they have one that's a use of force board that only focuses on any time officers have used force that can be considered to be excessive force or unjustified, or if there's a question about that. They also have their own civilian complaint review board, which receives complaints about any and all misconduct, not only uses of force, but even the way that officers engage with community members, if it's disrespectful, etc. And then they have a civilian oversight authority that essentially does an annual audit of that law enforcement agency's policies, practices, and also how they engage with the law, how they engage with community. And they draft up an annual report with their findings and recommendations on how issues where there's room for improvement, what can be done to actually move forward on those improvements. And so understand that these civilian oversight authorities have been in place for 3 going on 4 years now. And just to kind of speak to, at least from the Tucson, Arizona standpoint, what community empowerment looks like, they had an issue last year in 2020 where there was an officer-involved shooting, or an officer-involved death, I should say, of an individual who had mental health needs. And the law enforcement mishandled it, and they ended up killing this person. All right, this was a person of color. Now, initially, community members were in the streets calling for the chief to resign. But like I said, these 4 civilian oversight authorities were put into place by that same police chief. And a lot of community members came out, including the local government, in support of that chief. And when he gave in his resignation, they refused to accept it, okay? And instead, what they did is they said, we need to continue down this path of reform. And what that means is that we don't just put things in place and say, okay, we did this, we're done, tie it up in a knot, moving on to the next thing. We understand that public safety is an ever evolving area, and that there are things that are going to happen, a lot of gray area, not black and white, a lot of things that are going to happen that we're not going to be prepared for right now. And that's okay, because as long as we are responsive to the community, right? We already have the proactive strategy in place. Now we might have to do some reactive stuff. And it's all about us being responsive to our community. So you know what they did? They said that going forward, anytime there's another incident like this, where there's body-worn camera footage, right? Because the issue I should just highlight was that the body-worn camera footage was not released to the public in a timely fashion. I believe they released it months after the incident occurred rather than releasing the footage within like right after the incident occurred. Now going forward, they decided that anytime an incident like that happens on dash cam, body worn camera footage, or any other video footage that law enforcement has control over, that they are going to release that footage to the public. Well, first they're going to release it to the family members, right? And the community leaders within, I believe, 24 hours of the incident. And they're going to release it to the public within 48 hours of the incident. Now, to me, that is community empowerment, right? Because you're not just focused on what law enforcement wants or what the local government wants, right? You're focused on what community members, the news media, everybody plays a role. Everybody's a stakeholder when it comes to public safety in their community. And so the taxpayers are paying for this. They own that video footage. So they need to have the right to see it in a timely fashion and not be waiting for law enforcement to feel like they can now that it's years later or months later, we can now release that footage to you. So to me, I bring up that example because this is an example from a Republican majority state, right? Where the majority of the state legislature, the majority of the local governments are led by Republicans, and a lot of them are Trumpians. They support Trump. And so you see how even in a place like that, you can still get community empowerment centered policing reform to be effective. Doesn't have to be a state like Illinois where you have majority Democrats who are the composition of the state assembly and the government and the local government. So, you know, this is doable. It's already happening. It's not novel. It's not new. It's been happening and it's going to continue to happen. But what I've done is I've put it into a methodology and approach that's easy to understand with 3 points, the CAP method, and that any community can implement. And so that's the only thing that's new. But this going on, these processes have been going on and will continue to happen for years to come.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the holistic nature of your plan. Because in our binary society, where things are either white or black, Republican or Democrats, sometimes we lose sight of what is happening to certain communities. I may say communities that are often disenfranchised. See what the legislators are doing in some of the Republican states, impeding the ability of certain people to vote, because they know that if everyone is allowed to vote, as it should be in a democratic society, some of them may not have their jobs. So they have the technical tools that are exploiting to ensure that they impede the election. That's to go to the comment you made about the community involvement. I completely concur with you. I also support the idea of repurposing fund, because sometimes some people say that some people don't want police funded, or what some characterize as defunding the police, when in fact what they're saying is that they should be repurposing the funding to meaningfully deal with the issues of our time, such as people who may be disabled, and for some reasons, people who are in the police force will just go and do some harmful thing. So my question to you is, as you mentioned those people who are succeeding or following your footsteps or your ideas, what do you say about those whom you know that are not doing what they know that is right? Because I'm sure that if the table is turned around and their beloved ones are the people who are being killed by police, they would turn around and change it. So my question is, how are you planning to ensure that your ideas infiltrate into their planning, into the strategies for which they use to implement your plans as time goes on?
So I think that the way to do that is, number one, anytime I work with communities, I don't go into the community telling them what the solutions are. I go into communities and I ask them, what solutions do they want to see? Okay? Because at the end of the day, community members, and that includes also law enforcement, elected government officials, and the news media, They are the experts of their particular community, right? So a good example in Maryland, where you are, you have, for instance, you have Silver Spring, Maryland, you have Hyattsville, Maryland, you have all of these different municipalities in the same state. And even though they're all in the same state, they're all different when it comes to their culture, when it comes to their demographics, when it comes to what makes them who they are, their uniqueness, right? And because of that, policing needs to be aligned with that. And so does policing reform and public safety. And so I don't go into these communities acting as if I'm the expert of their community. I go in there and I go in humble and deferential. And I ask them, what is it that you want to see change? What do you think the problems are? And then based on what they tell me, we then work together through facilitated discussions, identifying the issues, and then determining what are the best solutions for that are in line with the CAP method, or with community empowerment centered policing reform through the CAP method. And then from there, we will then strategize and then implement that reform. And that can be in the form of police union contracts. That could be in the form of laws on the books. That could be in the form of departmental policies within a law enforcement agency. And it could also be in the form of trainings and practices of that law enforcement agency and of that community. Like what you just said, not every community wants to have law enforcement, right? Some of them believe that they can do this on their own without law enforcement, but they still need to have a process for how they're going to go about determining what that's going to look like and how they're going to get to that point. And that's where the CAP method comes in play. If it's an abolish police, defund methodology, or if it's more of a divest invest, we don't want to get rid of our police, but we want to reallocate some funds from law enforcement into social services, or if it's even 21st century policing, like what Obama was advancing, right? Or even law and order policing that our previous president had been advancing around the country. Every community is going to want something different, and I know some people say, oh, now that we don't have uniform standards, it's a hodgepodge of law enforcement reforms around the country. In my opinion, that's a good thing that we have a hodgepodge of reforms around the country, only because that's what America is all about. That's what the U.S. is about. The U.S. is not about homogeneity. It's not about uniformity. It's about diversity. It's about difference. And it's about rebelling. It's about basking. It's about acknowledging and enjoying that diversity and that multiculturalism. And that's not just solely about race and gender and sexual orientation and age and national origin. That's just also about communities and their culture on the local level, right? And so what I'm trying to say here is that policing reform needs to be aligned with that. And whatever model on policing reform is going to be applied to different communities around the country needs to be one that's adaptive and flexible, so it allows community members to not have this one-size-fits-all approach, right? Like defund everything, or law and order everything, or 21st century police and policing everything, or community engagement everything. It needs to be something that can be custom tailored for that community so that they have ownership of their public safety. And that's empowerment, not only of law enforcement, but of community members, local news media, and the appointed and elected government officials. And that's how we have true, in my opinion, reform on public safety, by not having a one-size-fits-all approach, but having an approach that's adaptive and flexible and encourages a hodgepodge, but in a constructive way where communities are empowered instead of being disempowered.
Thank you. Thank you. I had interviewed a number of police chiefs a while back, and during the interview, I realized that some of these police chiefs are not even involved in curriculum that they use to train the police force. And as a result, we gathered information that in Germany, before you become a police officer, you have to be trained for 2.5 years. But in the United States, you have some states that could just get you in 4 weeks and whatever, they get you out. And especially in those southern states like Mississippi and all those notorious states that consistently treat Black and brown people as if they are not human beings. It bothers me that while they have those people making decision as to what they should do or not do, they don't look at things in more broader way. Like, if they are aware of what is happening in Germany, why police has to be trained for 2.5 years, is grounded on the view that the Jewish people, the naivety, the terrible things they did to Jewish people. I think you can equate it with the sufferings of African Americans in the United States. So it seems to me that it's incumbent upon the so-called leaders to be able to look at what they had done to African American images. Some people may be frightened for whatever it may be, something could happen. With intuition, they just act. Say, for like you are standing like this, something goes by your ear, you instantly run. You don't really think about that. They should understand that police, when the police goes after African American in wherever they may be, the fear and pain and the history and documentation they see in and out by the media and so on, all those things cumulatively form their opinion. So when they see those things, by association, they will act in a way that may not necessarily be logical, like run. In that context, the police may say, oh, they're running, oh, just they're guilty, when in fact it's not. My question is, what can we do? How can the community learn how to train people reflecting history in order for police people or people who are trained to be police officers learn what they need to learn about the community they serve in order to serve them well?
So are you saying specifically police chiefs or just law enforcement in general?
Law enforcement in general, because I think that they should know why some people may run away when they're going after them. That is not necessarily that they are guilty, but it's just because of what remained, what they just seeing them reminds them. So when they run, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have committed the crime, as some people may think. So how can we navigate that so that the police that are sent to the street understand these activities, what may propel people to run, or maybe that could be a reason they could give for shooting them. What can we do in order to avoid those type of things?
Well, there's a few things. So one thing is, I know you mentioned the lack of hours in training compared to Germany. You know, what's interesting, even if you don't even look at Germany, look at America. I know, for instance, in Michigan, if you're a barber, or if you want to be a barber, or if you want to be like a nail or a hairstylist, you have to get a license and you have to get training. The amount of hours of training that are required of you to get your license to be a barber or a hairstylist in Michigan is substantially more than the number of hours that are required for you to become a law enforcement officer in the state of Michigan and to get that license. Okay, that alone, just think about that. All right, it's like, I believe, double or almost double the number for a barber or a hairstylist compared to a law enforcement or person trying to become law enforcement. So already just considering that, and the fact that lawyers and doctors are required to have like malpractice insurance in some cases for lawyers, for doctors in every instance, but law enforcement are not, right? I talked about Colorado being one state that's done it. Most states have not done what Colorado has done. They're essentially the bellwether on that, right? And so to me, that's one aspect, right? We need to make sure that we value the way that these individuals who have the power to take somebody's life away, which is the most valuable thing that any human being has, is your life. Because once that's gone, you don't get second chances on that. This is not like Mario Brothers, where you get to come back for like another 2 lives, right? That's not how it works. Once it's gone, it's gone. All right. So we want to make sure that these individuals are getting, in my opinion, more training than somebody who might just cut your head when they're giving you a haircut, or burn your hair when they're, getting your hair done or hair did, right? on top of that, so that's one thing. We need more hours for law enforcement than for other areas of law. We need to make sure that there is liability insurance for all law enforcement. I think that should be at least $100,000 per officer, including police chiefs and sheriffs. So that way, when they are found to have engaged in misconduct that involves violations of people's constitutional rights, they can be sued in court, and they'll have liability insurance to cover a portion of it. I don't want to get too much into the weeds of qualified immunity, because I have a whole process for that in regards to licensing and qualified immunity that we could talk about another time.
Thank you so much.
And then when it comes to the training itself, I'd like to refer back to the example that I provided from Illinois' recently enacted Safety Act around the crisis intervention techniques trainings. I think that is the model for what trainings need to look like for law enforcement going forward. And only the trainings that have to do with police-civilian interactions, like uses of force, people with mental health needs, etc. Okay? And that means that we have community members who don't have a law enforcement background, who are representative of those zip codes and neighborhoods where there are high levels of negative police interactions, to have to be a part of these trainings. I'm not talking about a youth academy or a citizen academy where they're not with the new recruits and in-service officers as they're going through the mandatory training. No, I'm talking about including them in the same training that those officers have to go through in order for them to keep their license in that state, and making sure that community members are able to provide feedback and let law enforcement know, okay, we understand why you do this now, right? But we do think that if you just make this tweak, change it in this little way, then it won't come off as if you're harassing and targeting people or a certain group of people, right? That kind of discourse and dialogue is not happening for the most part within communities and law enforcement, okay? They're siloed, and that's the problem. They're not a real community. A real community is gonna be working together as one community to do this. And the trainings, in my opinion, are one low-hanging fruit to bring these community members together while law enforcement are being trained, train individuals as well, and allow them to provide that feedback so that law enforcement can then troubleshoot and make those changes, those tweaks in the moment. And that's gonna help improve law enforcement for that particular community. Because what looks one way in Hyattsville is not going to look the same way in Silver Spring or in Columbia, Maryland, or in other cities in Maryland, right? So it's just understanding it needs to be custom tailored to that community. There can't be this one size fits all approach. And that, I think, is how we can change trainings overall in America. And I do think the Safety Act is one step in that direction that people should look to as a model.
Well, thank you. And I'm being prompted that time is running out, but I want to ask you another question or two if time permits. As you talked about the diversity of the United States, how would you use that to discuss communities that are mostly communities that really don't care about minority, and minority happen to be those in powerless position? How would you address those type of things? Because obviously the people in power are not interested in the things that happen to the minority. That's where you see things happening that are so detrimental that in fact are never gonna be good. That one goes. If you can comment on that, but I have one more question to squeeze in here. I see your work. I see your cat metaphor. I love it. But my question though is, as you work at the federal, state, and local government levels, helping them to reimagine the way their police work with their community, how would you encourage them to develop a sustained, continued relationship among the three so that they can come up with something that will work? I know that unfortunately, Congress has refused to implement George Floyd rules, which is depressing, because it seems to me that they want, I hate to say it this way, but as somebody who see the emotions and the pain and anguish and support of all diverse communities within the United States. In support of that type of, legislation, the federal government, the state, and both the Senate and the other level of government, legislators, they failed, and they failed woefully. It makes me to question the meaning of democracy. I thought his representatives representing the people. It seems to me that these are type of, you can reverse it, say representatives representing themselves and not necessarily what most people have agreed to be the solution to our problem.
So I'm gonna answer both. So number one, I think that when we're talking about how can those who are disempowered have power in communities where they are the minority rather than the majority, it goes back to the second provision, or the second slide on the Safety Act that I showed, where I gave you an example of that model language, where it essentially says that there needs to be two persons who are residents of Illinois who are coming from neighborhoods where there's a high disproportionate impact of law enforcement contacts. There's a high level of gun violence, child poverty, commitments to the state prison, etc. We need to start using very detailed language like that for policies and for laws on the books. And I even say for collective bargaining agreements, when we're talking about community members having a seat at the table, especially as it relates to civilian oversight, okay? And in my opinion, what needs to happen is really taking that language that Illinois has passed into law and trying to replicate it and custom tailor it for each different community. I don't think it should just be state governments doing that. I think it can happen on the local level when we're talking about civilian advisory boards or civilian complaint review boards or inspector general's offices, etc., independent monitors and all the such. I think that it could also be applied on the federal level, right? And this can help inform the federal government on how they should go about not only drafting, introducing, and passing legislation, but most importantly, implementation, right? Because you could pass anything, but it's all about implementing it so that you actually see the change that you intended to see, right? And in order to do that, in my opinion, you need to have proper representation. You need to make sure the people who have their fingers on the pulse on what's happening with community police relations are the ones at the table making those decisions and making them in a substantial way where they have at least 50% of the voting block, right? Not 10%, not 25%, not even 40%, at least 50%, because they are the ones that are going to be most directly impacted by these reforms because they live in those communities. The other community members, they live in communities where they have great relationships with law enforcement. When they call for law enforcement, they show up almost immediately, and they don't have to worry about them harassing people that look like them just to try to find a suspect, right? And going after anybody and everybody who might, quote unquote, fit the description. So we want to make sure that those community members that are most adversely impacted by policing, that they are the ones who are going to be at the table deciding the direction policing reform goes in and why or why it should not, because they are the ones that can explain it in detail because they're living it every day. Okay, so that's what I think is the direction we need to go in. Now, in regards to your second question, what I think, and this ties into the answer to the first question, is I think looking at this model language with the Illinois Safety Act, and like I mentioned, Washington State and New Mexico and Colorado and all the such, even Maryland, right, with the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights that was essentially eliminated, which is historical, all right? They need to look at what is it they're doing that is strong and that's working, and what is it they're doing that's not, and that can use some support. And how can we in our role support that and also try to replicate that on the federal level through federal legislation and policy? And I also believe that one of the things that the federal government can do pretty much at any time, they don't have to wait for next year, midterm elections, or in a couple of years after midterm elections to do this, is to start providing funding to local communities, not only municipalities and local law enforcement agencies, but also to community-based organizations, direct service providers, and directly impacted individuals to be able to craft and reimagine what public safety looks like for them. Like I said, I don't go into communities telling them what the solutions are. I go into those communities deferential, asking them what solutions, what reforms, what is it you want to see for public safety in your community, all right? And the federal government, I think, would be great if they had a similar approach and did that and backing it up with federal dollars. So that way communities can get to work on this in the meantime, while the federal government's trying to figure out what to do in the future on policing reform on the federal level, they can give them what they need right now in the present. So they can start getting to work on what they could do on the state and local level, if it be with their law enforcement or even without them. But at the end of the day, they're still going to be working together on that interconnectedness, because even when it comes to eliminating law enforcement, we've seen this in Burlington, Vermont, where they actually did successfully defund their law enforcement agency. They had to do that with law enforcement. They couldn't just defund them without working with their local elected officials and law enforcement on changing their municipal charter to allow community members to have the power to determine hiring, to determine how many officers that Burlington Police Department can have on the force, to determine like what the standards are for disciplining and terminating officers who engage in misconduct, okay? You have to work together on this in order for it to work. And I think that's the key takeaway from community empowerment-centered policing reform and the CAP method, is not being divided, not being in silos, but coming together as one community to support public safety and ensure police accountability through more so proactive rather than reactive strategies.
Thank you. I completely agree with you. And I want to send you a special thank you for your persisting and using your legal training to help legislators and communities to frame the kind of language that would incorporate and deal with all the loopholes that people usually punch in order to do all sort of atrocities and get away with it. And I also want to thank you for coining the term CAT, which is community empowerment, accountability, and transparency. I think we clearly incorporated all the components that if people adhere to, will make a difference. And I hope that people out there who are truly well-meaning to deal with the issues of inequities in our society can at least look at this thing and hopefully use it in ways that it puts them on the right trajectory to creating a better society. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nwoye. That has been Dr. Joseph Nwoye in conversation with Carlton T. Myers, Esquire, from Carlton, from Myers Strategic Solutions, LLC. This has been a production from Systemic Diversity and Inclusion Group, based in London, based in Maryland, based in Accra, based in Tokyo, and even based in Pakistan. Mr. Myers, thank you so much for joining us today. Very, very much appreciated.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to working with SDIG going forward.